The matter spread as though Flaxborough itself had been waiting for just such a morsel of disturbance. By the evening, even the landlord of the Blue Lion, who prided himself on refusing to traffic in idle speculation, was obliged to declare that he knew for a fact the bone had been found clasping a ring. At the Women's Institute, meanwhile, there was firm agreement that the council had known about burials behind the houses in Rose Crescent for years and had, naturally, concealed the fact from ratepayers. Mrs. Brindle, who had returned home after her dramatic morning, with the air of a heroine retiring to well-earned repose, received a steady trickle of visitors. They arrived ostensibly to comfort her, but were plainly more intent on measuring the drama of her discovery against her curtains, carpets, and general manner of life. The widow bore this attention with the self-control of one whose griefs, both genuine and cultivated, had always found their richest nourishment in an audience. Across the town, the police station endured its own chorus. Several citizens telephoned to offer theories, each delivered in the tone of one who feared the inspector might otherwise never see the obvious. An elderly retired dentist insisted that the remains must be part of the skeleton displayed in the window of a rival practice 20 years before, which had been suspiciously withdrawn. A shopkeeper suggested it was a practical joke perpetrated by schoolboys, noting that they can get bones, you know, from butchers. Purbright received these messages with the equanimity of a man accustomed to navigating between extremes of imagination and boredom. He sat quietly at his desk, long face bent, as if examining the surface of the blotter for evidence, though in fact he was listening to the rhythm of Sergeant Love's reports. By morning, the inspector had determined upon his first, most civil step, to hear Mrs. Brindle herself. There was, he felt, nothing quite so clarifying as the way in which a person told their own story when given uninterrupted scope to do so. Rose Crescent was a row of neat middle-class houses built during that period of municipal optimism which had assumed that a privet hedge, once planted, would endure indignity forever. Mrs. Brindle's residence stood towards the end, distinguished chiefly by an assortment of china animals pressed against the front window glass. She welcomed Purbright with the grave pleasure of one who recognizes her role in a matter of public importance. Her drawing-room, rich in lace and varnish, exuded the faint sweetness of furniture polish and a less faint note of something medicinal. "I do not know what to think, Inspector," she began, once he was seated and provided with tea that was more colour than flavour. "One takes up the soil in good faith, believing it to be innocent, and then—" She paused, lowering her eyes, "to find what one finds. It quite overset me." Purbright inclined his head. "You were planting, I believe?" "Bulbs, Inspector, daffodils, a hopeful flower. I had thought the border would benefit from them. It was while turning the earth near the wall that my spade met with a hardness. At first, I believed it to be a root. Then, well, you saw." She folded her hands together carefully, like a woman posing for an illustrated Sunday magazine. "Had you noticed anything odd in that part of the garden before?" Purbright asked gently. "Only that the ground was never so firm as elsewhere. I have had, what shall I say, difficulty with puddling after rain, though I have not considered it criminal." There was a trace of tartness in the last word, a reminder that Mrs. Brindle valued her wit as much as her virtue. Purbright allowed her another few sentences, noting more the rhythm of her speech than the matter itself. When at last he rose, thanking her with characteristic courtesy, the inspector left with the impression not so much of what she had told him as of what she had rehearsed. Outside he paused to regard the neatness of the crescent. Behind each trim hedge and curtain lay lives conducted with precision and with small secrets nourished like indoor plants. Mrs. Brindle, he thought, had stumbled across something that had not been meant for her bulbs to disturb. Back at the station, Sergeant Love looked up expectantly as Purbright returned. "She seems," Purbright remarked mildly, hanging his hat upon the stand, "to be enjoying her tragedy rather too much." The sergeant frowned. "You mean she planted it there herself?" Purbright shook his head. "Not yet, love. Let us be patient. The town, I expect, will oblige us with some further enlightenment." And indeed, by the afternoon, the enlightenment arrived, wrapped in whispers, and delivered in the market square once more, where several citizens were heard to declare that Mrs. Brindle had enemies. Inspector Purbright began his inquiries with the same patient deliberation he might have applied to locating a misfiled form in the borough archives. To the untrained eye, it appeared he was merely taking an afternoon stroll about town, nodding amiably to this or that citizen, pausing to observe a cart of lettuces or exchange remarks about the weather. Yet by tea-time he had gently coaxed from Flaxborough several narratives of the Brindle household, none identical, all suspiciously confident. At the grocer's, Mrs. Pennefather leaned conspiratorially across her scales. "You'll find, Inspector, that widow never could keep her accounts, always short with money, though always plentiful with pronouncements. If you ask me, bones are only the beginning. You'll find a body or two still owing." At the post office, Mr. Chubb, a man who delivered letters with a precision bordering on passion, remarked that Mrs. Brindle was over-particular about who walked past her gate, always twitching curtains, and yet she feeds the cats of the neighbourhood, every stray, every mangy brute. Odd behaviour, one might almost say morbid. Even the vicar, when cornered near the churchyard wall, contributed something in his melancholy baritone. The late Mr. Brindle was a somewhat irascible gentleman, one does not, of course, suggest, but Mrs. Brindle bore it all with remarkable fortitude. The pause before repeating the phrase hinted that fortitude might conceal other qualities less ecclesiastically celebrated. Purbright listened, never arguing, never agreeing, but storing each phrase like pebbles dropped one by one into a pond to observe where the ripples might intersect. His manner was unfailingly courteous, which only encouraged the talkers to embellish their tales with greater flourish. The inspector's ability to appear faintly bored while listening was, in fact, his most reliable instrument. People abhorred disinterest. They filled silences with more than they intended. When he returned to the station, he found Sergeant Love struggling with the bone itself, which had been placed, rather inappropriately, upon a brown office blotter. "Dr. Hilliard had a look," Love reported. "Says it's definitely human, male and not less than 20 years in the ground." Purbright raised his brows slightly, as if this were a trifle earlier than he had expected. "And did our good doctor speculate further?" "Not exactly, though he did mutter about saw marks, could be medical, or could be worse." The inspector took a seat, steepling his long fingers. "Yes," he murmured, "medical, or worse. A choice which rather sums up human history, wouldn't you say?" Love blinked. "Shall I call at the hospital, then?" "In due course. First, we must know a little more of Mrs. Brindle's neighbours. Bones, however old, do not enter flower-beds unaided." Accordingly, Purbright paid calls in Rose Crescent the following day. Mr. Caldecott at No. 7 claimed to have heard nothing but the widow's piano on Sunday evenings. "Scales, Inspector, only scales, a sign, I dare say, of a guilty conscience." Meanwhile, at No. 4, a young couple, the Fishers, were eager to explain how Mrs. Brindle's cat-feeding attracted rats the size of rabbits. They offered, unsolicited, a vivid description of scratching noises in the walls, which they felt must have a bearing on the matter. By dusk the inspector possessed no shortage of testimony, but very little fact. What he did have, however, was a sense of proportion. The town's imagination had run several miles ahead of the bone itself. And amid all the chatter, one curious element recurred. More than one person, sometimes in jest, sometimes in lowered tones, hinted that the late Mr. Brindle had not, as officially recorded, died peacefully in his sleep after an attack of apoplexy. He had, they whispered, been helped along by the widow's patients. Purbright, considering this, allowed himself the smallest smile. Townsfolk, after all, preferred their scandals to have sharp corners. Yet the inspector also knew that the persistence of a rumour was often less about what it alleged than about what it concealed. The file on Mrs. Brindle, once a thin folder containing nothing more than a routine probate notice, was about to acquire a thickness which, though made entirely of gossip, would nonetheless be weighty enough to occupy the inspector's desk. By the end of the week the town had already settled on a convenient solution. It was, in their eyes, the simplest of equations: a bone in the widow's garden, a disagreeable late husband, and a woman with both motive and opportunity. Even Sergeant Love, who was not normally given to rushing ahead of his inspector, found himself murmuring that it might all add up rather neat, sir. Purbright did not rebuke him. He merely adjusted his spectacles and observed, "Neatness, love, is a quality rarely found in either human nature or flower beds." Nevertheless, the murmuring did not abate. At the Blue Lion, drinkers declared it was only a matter of time before the inspector clapped irons on the widow. At the hairdresser's, Mrs. Shuttleworth confided to her captive clients that Mrs. Brindle had once been seen carrying a shovel into her garden at dusk, "which is not a time for bulbs, dear." Even the town clerk, meeting Purbright in the corridor of the police station, hinted that a widow's pension is not, after all, an entirely reliable income. It was the path of least resistance, and Flaxborough had always favoured such paths. Mrs. Brindle had disposed of her husband, and now, fate having brought her to account, would be tidied neatly into the record books of crime. The widow herself did little to discourage this assumption. When questioned again, she adopted the melancholy serenity of a woman prepared to endure calumny for the sake of truth. She shook her head with tragic dignity when asked about her husband's death, her voice dropping to a whisper as though even memory were indecent to share. It was an admirable performance, and one which satisfied all but the inspector. Purbright, who listened more closely to silences than to words, noted two peculiarities. First, the widow's eyes did not linger on the floor or ceiling in the manner of one searching for recollection. Instead, they darted toward the mantel clock, as though measuring the progress of each phrase. Second, she appeared almost too composed, her grief rehearsed, her indignation comfortably upholstered. The counsel, delighted by the prospect of an uncomplicated scandal, pressed discreetly for speed. It would be a mercy to the town, the mayor suggested in a confidential aside, if this could be settled before the flower show. Outsiders may otherwise form an unfortunate impression. Purbright responded with polite gravity, but his eyes carried that faint gleam, which to those few who recognized it, signaled the inspector's mind quietly turning elsewhere. For though the obvious solution beckoned, widow, bone, husband, the inspector could not ignore a smaller, more vexing puzzle. Among the items removed from the Brindle garden had been a handful of fragments, splinters of wood, rusted wire, and, oddly enough, a button of the sort once worn on workmen's coats. A button in a flower bed was no rare thing, but when Purbright turned it over in his fingers, noting the faint groove where stitching had once drawn it tight, he filed it away as something to be revisited. In Flaxborough, the trivial was often the doorway to the telling. Still, for the moment, the widow remained everyone's favourite culprit. The town had chosen her, and like most of Flaxborough's choices, it seemed unlikely to be surrendered without fuss. Purbright, in his patient way, allowed the tide of suspicion against Mrs. Brindle to swell until it was almost too large to be contradicted. He knew from experience that a town's appetite for scandal could not be curbed by abrupt denial. One must wait until its hunger shifted of its own accord, guided by some morsel more curious than the last. That morsel arrived in the form of the button. It had been bagged with no ceremony by Sergeant Love, who regarded it as no more than garden litter, but Purbright had placed it carefully aside. Over several evenings he examined it in the lamplight of his office, a dull black, the sort sewn upon stout serge, larger than those adorning ordinary shop coats. Its edge was chipped, and the back bore the corroded remnant of thread. What fixed the inspector's attention, however, was less its appearance than its incongruity. If the bone had lain beneath the soil for decades, the button, though rusted, seemed curiously less time-worn, as though its exile underground were briefer. On the third evening, Purbright slipped the item into his pocket and walked across to Dr. Hilliard's surgery. The doctor, whose knowledge of pathology was rivalled only by his fondness for whisky and tea, received the inspector with cautious cheer. He peered at the button through spectacles that had slid so far down his nose they appeared in imminent danger of departure. "Workman's," he declared, with the certainty of one who enjoys being consulted. "I'd say a roadman's, or perhaps one of those council fellows who mend drains. They wore coats of heavy fustian. Buttons like this. Haven't seen them much since the war." Purbright thanked him, pocketed the relic, and ambled back into the night. His step was unhurried, yet the direction of his thoughts had shifted. Meanwhile, Flaxborough persisted in its tale of the murderous widow. Even at the station, Sergeant Love muttered, "Don't see what a button proves, sir." Could have been dropped there any time. "Indeed, Love," Purbright replied with a faint smile. "But dropped when and by whom, that is the seasoning which makes even the plainest stew more interesting." The sergeant looked mystified, as he always did, when the inspector turned domestic metaphor into evidence. By the following morning, Purbright had quietly arranged to see the records of the Borough Works Department. He spent an hour in the clerk's dusty office, leafing through ledgers that smelled faintly of damp and forgotten overtime. There, among the wages lists of long-departed men, he found entries for one foreman named Horrocks, deceased, drowned in a canal in 1939, but whose men had worked in Rose Crescent on a drainage fault not long before. A workman's coat, a drainage trench, and a bone that appeared older than its companion button. Purbright began to sense that the neat tale of a widow and her husband might, after all, be too conveniently stitched together. And as if to confirm that the inspector's patience was justified, Flaxborough soon obliged him with another development, this time rather more sudden than Mrs. Brindle's daffodils. The town, having tired, if only slightly, of repeating the same variations on Mrs. Brindle's supposed guilt, soon sought fresh amusements. Flaxborough was never short of candidates willing to supply them. First came Mr. Pym, proprietor of the Crescent stores, a man whose inventory of grievances against his neighbours was far more extensive than that of his groceries. He intercepted Purbright during a casual walk through the square, lowering his voice as though the cobblestones might overhear. "You'll not find me surprised about bones in that garden, Inspector. Not a bit. She never buys from me unless she's forced, you know. Walks past my window as though I were invisible, but I've seen men, workmen, about her back gate after dark, once last spring, twice the year before. No good comes of such things." Purbright thanked him mildly, and received in return a look of irritation. Mr. Pym was a man who preferred his intelligence to be treated as a revelation rather than as another pebble dropped into the inspector's pond. Later that day, Purbright encountered Mrs. Plumbley, a retired midwife who had made it her mission to be the custodian of other people's secrets. She explained, with much lowering of voice and careful glances, that Mrs. Brindle had been far too familiar with the late Mr. Horrocks, the drainage foreman. She gave him tea in her parlour, Inspector. Tea! A married woman entertaining a man who could hardly keep his braces up. If you ask me, it was more than drains he was mending. The inspector, who never asked, but always listened, made a courteous note of this before moving on. Nor were the revelations confined to the widow. The fishers of Number 4 had taken to accosting any passer-by with complaints about the smell from her compost heap, which they considered practically criminal. Meanwhile, at Number 8, Mr. Caldecott muttered darkly that his apple tree had ceased bearing fruit after the Brindles moved in, and that he had never trusted them since. By the time Purbright returned to the station, Sergeant Love had received half a dozen similar reports, each laced with motives ranging from marital jealousy to property disputes. The sheer abundance of grievance was enough to puzzle even Love, who usually preferred matters to sort themselves into tidy piles. "Seems everyone in Rose Crescent had it in for her, sir," he remarked, shuffling through the notes. "Indeed," Purbright said. "And when everyone is equally indignant, it usually means the truth lies elsewhere, quietly ignored." What interested him most was not the loudest testimony, but the quieter omissions. The name of Horrocks, the long-dead foreman, had slipped almost too neatly into Mrs. Plumley's gossip. Purbright could not help wondering how many others remembered him and why they were reluctant to say so plainly. As the inspector sat in thought, the evening bell of St. Chad's chimed across the town. It marked the end of an ordinary day, yet Purbright knew it had carried him a step closer to the core of the matter. For if bones had risen once in Flaxborough, there was no reason to suppose they would not rise again. And so, a few days later, the town was given its second incident. The second disturbance came, as such things often did in Flaxborough, by way of a child. One Saturday morning, young Colin Fisher, whose parents had already contributed a wealth of indignation about the Brindle garden, returned from an unsanctioned exploration of the waste ground behind the Crescent. He carried under his arm a battered tin box, the sort that might once have held biscuits in a less adventurous household. When prized open before a gathering of neighbours, it was discovered to contain not rusty nails or marbles, as some had hoped, but several more bones, smaller, these yet unquestionably human. The news spread with such vigour that Sergeant Love had scarcely set foot on the ground before 3 versions were being retailed at once: that the box had been buried beneath Mrs. Brindle's compost heap, that the widow herself had been seen running from the scene, and that the boy had been guided to the discovery by a spectral figure in a workman's coat. In fact, the tin had lain half buried near a collapsed length of fencing, some yards from any garden, in soil disturbed long ago by digging. Yet proximity, in the minds of Flaxborough citizens, was evidence enough. By noon, Mrs. Brindle's reputation had sunk so low that only the most obstinate contrarians withheld judgment. Purbright, however, received the development with that same mild expression which concealed more than it revealed. He examined the box carefully in his office, noting the corroded hinges, the faint smell of oil, and, pressed into one corner, a shred of cloth. It was dark and stiff, almost leather-like with age. Dr. Hilliard, summoned with some reluctance from his Saturday comforts, confirmed that the bones belonged to a child assistant. "Years old," he muttered, peering at them with a mixture of awe and irritation. "Decades, perhaps, nothing recent, but whoever put them in that box did so with purpose. A makeshift coffin, if you like, not a casual disposal." Sergeant Love frowned deeply, his loyalty to the widow theory wavering. "So not a husband then, sir?" Unless the late Mr. Brindle was both diminutive and unusually pliable, Purbright replied dryly. I think we must broaden our view. The inspector's view, in fact, broadened considerably. For the tin box suggested secrecy older than any surviving quarrel in Rose Crescent. It spoke of concealment, of quiet panic, of the kind of domestic arrangement which never reached the parish registers. That evening, as Purbright walked the Crescent again, he found the curtains drawn tighter than before, and the eyes that followed him from between them sharper, more suspicious. It was no longer merely Mrs. Brindle's misfortune under discussion. The entire street was implicated, if only by the uncomfortable fact that none had noticed, or chosen to remember, what had once been buried in their midst. Flaxborough had given the inspector its second puzzle, and this one, he knew, would not be unravelled by gossip alone. That night, after the bones in their biscuit tin had been locked away, and Sergeant Love had gone home to his supper, Inspector Purbright remained in his office, leaning back in his chair with the unhurried stillness of a man who found thought more nourishing than food. The lamp cast a narrow pool of light across his desk, illuminating the brown ledger, in which he had recorded with neatness bordering on indifference the sequence of events. 2 sets of bones, one a solitary fragment in a widow's flower bed, the other a child's remains arranged with rough care in a box. Both uncovered by chance, both too old for modern mischief. What struck Purbright was not merely the existence of these relics, but the town's response to them, a determination to bind the story into a single, neat parcel, and to place it, tied and labelled, at Mrs. Brindle's gate. Purbright knew this impulse well. Flaxborough was not wicked, it was orderly. It cherished its small routines, the flower show, the library raffle, the council's interminable debates over lamp-posts. Disorder was tolerated only so long as it could be converted into narrative, preferably scandalous, that explained everything and required no further thought. The widow, with her tragic air and her late husband's less than charming reputation, offered precisely that. Yet the inspector's mind returned again and again to the button, to Horrocks' name in the borough ledgers, and now to the child's bones, hidden in a workman's box. These did not fit the town's tidy scheme. They spoke, rather, of something older, messier, concealments made not for notoriety but for shame. He considered human habit. Respectability, he mused, was often a thicker hedge than any in Rose Crescent. People hid within it the sort of compromises that kept households intact, reputations untouched, and neighbours unsuspecting. When such hedges grew dense enough, entire histories could vanish behind them, until only a chance spade or a boy's curiosity dragged them back into the light. Purbright closed his eyes briefly. He thought of Mrs. Brindle, so ready to play the martyr, so rehearsed in her indignation. Was she a liar? Undoubtedly, but not necessarily the guilty one. He thought, too, of the neighbours, each more eager than the last to share some grievance. Their readiness was itself suspicious. Too much pleasure in accusation usually hinted at an eagerness to divert attention. He opened his eyes again, gazing across the silent office. In the darkness beyond the lamplight lay the unspoken question. Whose shame had been buried in that soil, and why had it needed so many bones to keep it hidden? The clock on the wall struck 11. Purbright rose, replaced the ledger in his drawer, and extinguished the lamp. The inspector's reflections, though unvoiced, had coalesced into something approaching resolution. It was not merely a question of bones, but of memory, and whose memory would not bear too much examination. In the morning, he told himself, it would be time to disturb the hedges a little. The following afternoon, Purbright set about his purpose with the same unhurried civility he might have brought to ordering a library book. His test, as Sergeant Love would later describe it, was neither dramatic nor conspicuous. It was simply a matter of putting a question at the right moment, in the right company, and then letting silence do the work. He began with a polite request to Mrs. Brindle that she join him for a short interview at the police station. The widow arrived with the solemn composure of one who considered herself already half acquitted, half saint. Her hat was too large for her head, which lent her dignity the air of a theatrical prop. Purbright seated her in the interview room, poured tea with his usual care, and allowed several minutes of comfortable inanities to pass. At length, in the same mild voice with which he might have asked after her bulbs, he inquired, "Do you recall, madam, the workman who repaired your drains in 1938? The widow's spoon clinked against her cup. A small thing, but sharper to Purbright's ear than any raised voice. "My drains, Inspector?" she repeated with a little too much emphasis. I can't say that I do." Purbright gave a gentle nod as if the matter were of no importance at all. "Ah, perhaps not. One forgets such trifles. I only wondered if you might have given them refreshment in the house. Tea, perhaps? A foreman named Horrocks?" For the first time Mrs. Brindle's mask slipped. Her eyes flickered, not toward the inspector but toward the door, as if expecting someone else to enter. The silence stretched, filled not with denial, but with calculation. Purbright said nothing further. He merely sipped his tea and allowed the pause to lengthen until Mrs. Brindle, desperate to regain the rhythm, launched into a rambling defence. She had entertained many callers, she explained. It was her duty as a housewife. She could hardly be expected to recall the names of every man who mended a pipe or a hedge. Her voice grew sharper, the sentences longer, and in that excess Purbright heard what he had been waiting for, a note of fear, not of accusation, but of discovery. When at last he rose and thanked her with grave courtesy, the widow departed in visible relief, mistaking the inspector's silence for surrender. She had not noticed that he had never once suggested guilt. Later that evening, Purbright paid an equally casual visit to Mrs. Plumbley, the retired midwife whose memory had proved so obliging. With the same mild tone, he asked her whether she remembered any family in Rose Crescent who had lost a child without the formality of burial. Mrs. Plumbley, startled, coloured and stammered, then declared that such matters were not for her to discuss, which of course was quite as revealing as anything she might have said. By nightfall, Purbright felt the hedge of respectability had rustled just enough to confirm his suspicion. The bones belonged not to any sudden act of violence, but to a longer, sadder concealment, one in which several of the Crescent's oldest residents had quietly conspired. Now all that remained was to place the matter squarely before them, in a setting so ordinary it would strip the drama from denial. The reveal, when it came, was delivered with so little ceremony that those present were almost disappointed. Purbright had invited only a handful of people to the station. Mrs. Brindle, of course, Mrs. Plumbley, who arrived with a face like curdled cream, Mr. Caldecott from number 8, and the ever-faithful Sergeant Love, who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else but could not quite resist the curiosity. The inspector arranged them in the interview room with the quiet precision of a man laying out cutlery. He did not raise his voice, nor strike any theatrical pose. He merely folded his hands upon the table and began as though chairing a parish committee. "Thank you all for coming. It has been suggested that the bones discovered in Rose Crescent are connected with the late Mr. Brindle. That suggestion is convenient. It is also quite wrong." Mrs. Brindle gave a sharp intake of breath, half relief, half fresh alarm. The others stared at their teacups. Purbright continued, his tone courteous, almost apologetic. "The larger bone, from your garden, madam, is indeed adult, but it is decades old, far older than your husband's passing. The The smaller remains in the tin box are those of a child. They were placed there carefully with some attempt at dignity, though without the knowledge of church or registry. Such concealments usually arise from sorrow that cannot be spoken of openly, a child stillborn perhaps, or one who lived only briefly. In such cases, appearances matter more to families than truth. So the infant is hidden, and neighbours, out of pity or discretion, pretend not to notice. Mrs. Plumbley stirred uneasily. Purbright's eyes rested on her, though his voice remained neutral. A midwife, for instance, might have known, might even have helped in the belief that she was sparing a household shame. It was not uncommon 30 or 40 years ago. The old woman's lips pressed together. She said nothing, but the flush in her cheeks betrayed her memory. As for the adult bone, Purbright went on, I believe it was disturbed when the drainage men worked there in the late 30s. A button from their coats was found among the fragments. Foreman Horrocks, in particular, was known in Rose Crescent. He and his men would have unearthed an older burial, a pauper's grave, perhaps from before the houses were built, and chosen not to trouble officialdom with it. They left what they could not explain. Time, as it does, covered everything again, until your spade, Mrs. Brindle, brought it back. There was a long pause. The little room seemed filled less with guilt than with the discomfort of secrets dragged into daylight. Purbright's voice softened. So you see, this is not a tale of murder, but of concealments, each in its way born of shame or fear, or the human wish to keep up appearances. The widow's reputation need not be stained, nor the Crescent's households gossiped into ruin. We may record the finds respectfully and leave it at that. He rose, signalling the meeting's end with the gentle finality of a school bell. I should advise, however, that from this point onward there is no profit in further speculation. Flaxborough will doubtless prefer its gossip to the truth, but the truth is, alas, quite dull. The group dispersed awkwardly. Mrs. Brindle, with a brittle smile of relief, Mrs. Plumbley stiff with the effort of not confessing, and Mr. Caldecott muttering about apple trees as though fruit might explain everything. Only Sergeant Love lingered, looking perplexed. You mean, sir, there was never a crime at all? Purbright put on his hat. On the contrary, Love, there was the small, perennial crime of concealment, one practised in every town, in every generation. Only the subjects differ, and in Flaxborough, as everywhere, bones have a way of rising when least convenient. The town, having been deprived of the scandal it had so industriously rehearsed, settled back into its routines with only the mild irritation of a thwarted appetite. At the Feathers, the regulars turned their commentary away from bones and burials and back to the comparative shortcomings of the county cricket side. Mrs. Brindle resumed her marketing expeditions, now accompanied by rather too much determination to look serene and untroubled. Mrs. Plumbley, though she was not officially censured, walked about with a stiffened dignity, as though daring anyone to hint at what she might once have known. Her neighbours were obliging enough to respect her silence, though not without the occasional whisper about certain goings-on in the old days. Mr. Caldecott, relieved of suspicion, spoke rather more often than anyone wished about the fruitfulness of his Bramleys, and seemed not to notice when people drifted away before his account of their pruning was half done. As for Sergeant Love, he still struggled with the concept of an investigation that produced no handcuffs, no charge sheets, no headlines. Purbright, who saw his subordinate's disappointment, offered the consoling thought that justice is sometimes best served when it remains politely uninvited. Love nodded, though without conviction. In the police station, the inspector turned his attention back to the comfortable dullness of reports and memoranda, his pen scratching with quiet steadiness. Outside, Flaxborough's streets went on with their familiar commerce, shop blinds snapping in the wind, milk lorries clinking, and the afternoon gossip being brewed along with the tea. It was, in short, once more a town that appeared to be exactly what it wished to appear, ordinary. And yet, as Purbright knew, such ordinariness was only ever a coverlet, under which bones of every sort, whether literal or otherwise, waited with perfect patience to be uncovered again.